The Taste of Melon by Borden Deal. When I think of the summer I was 16, a lot of things come crowding in to be thought about. We had moved just the year before, and 16 is still young enough that the bunch makes a difference. I had a bunch all right, but they weren't sure of me yet. I didn't know why. Maybe because I'd lived in town and my father still worked there instead of farming like the other fathers did. The boys I knew, even Freddie Gray and J.D., still kept a small distance between us. Then there was Willadine Wills. I hadn't been much interested in girls before, but I had to admit to myself that I was interested in Willadine. She was my age, nearly as tall as I, and up till the year before, Freddie Gray told me she had been good at playing gully keeper and ante over. But she didn't play such games this year. She was tall and slender, and Freddie Gray and J.D. and I had several discussions about the way she walked. I maintained she was putting it on, but J.D. claimed she couldn't help it. Freddie Gray remarked that she hadn't walked that way last year. He said she'd walked like any other human being. So then I said, put on or not, I liked the way she walked, and then there was a large silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence because of Mr. Wills, Willadine's father. We were all afraid of Mr. Wills. Mr. Wills was a big man. He had bright, fierce eyes under heavy brows, and when he looked down at you, you just withered. The idea of having him directly and immediately angry at one of us was enough to shrivel the soul. All that summer, Willadine walked up and down the high road, or sat on their front porch in a rocking chair, her dress flared out around her, and not one of us dared to do more than say good morning to her. Mr. Wills was the best farmer in the community. My father said he could drive a stick into the ground and grow a tree out of it. But it wasn't an easy thing with him. Mr. Wills fought the earth when he worked it. When he plowed his fields, you could hear him yelling for a mile. It was as though he dared the earth not to yield him its sustenance. Above all, Mr. Wills could raise watermelons. Now, watermelons are curious things. Some men can send off for the best watermelon seed. They can plant it in the best ground they own. They can hoe it and tend it with the greatest of care, and they can't raise a watermelon bigger than your 2 fists. Other men, like Mr. Wills, can throw seed on the ground, scuff dirt over it, walk off and leave it, and have a crop of the prettiest, biggest melons you ever saw. Mr. Wills always planted the little field directly behind his barn to watermelons. It ran from the barn to the creek, a good piece of land with just the right sandy soil for a melon raising, and it seemed as though the melons just bulged up out of the ground for him. But they were Mr. Willis's melons. He didn't have any idea of sharing them with the boys of the neighborhood. He was fiercer about his melons than anything else. If you just happened to walk close to his melon patch, you'd see Mr. Wills standing and watching you with a glower on his face, and likely as not, he'd have his gun under his arm. Everybody expected to lose a certain quantity of their watermelons to terrapins and certain quantity to boys. It wasn't considered stealing to sneak into a man's melon patch and judiciously borrow a sample of his raisings. You might get a load of salt in the seat of your pants if you were seen, but that was part of the game. You'd be looked down on only if you got malicious and stamped a lot of the melons into the ground while you were about it. But Mr. Wills didn't think that way. That summer I was 16, Mr. Wills raised the greatest watermelon ever seen in the country. It grew in the very middle of his patch, 3 times as big as any melon anybody had ever seen. Men came from miles around to look at it. Mr. Wills wouldn't let them go into the melon patch. They had to stand around the edge. Just like all the other daredevil boys in that country, I guess, Freddie Gray and J.D. and I had talked idly about stealing that giant watermelon. But we all knew that it was just talk. Not only were we afraid of Mr. Wills and his rages, but we knew that Mr. Wills sat in the hayloft window of his barn every night with his shotgun, guarding the melon. It was his seed melon. He meant to plant next year's crop out of that great one, and maybe raise a whole field of them. Mr. Wills was in a frenzy of fear that somebody would steal it. Why, he would rather you stole Willadine than his melon. At least he didn't guard Willadine with his shotgun. Every night I could sit on our front porch and see Mr. Wills sitting up there in the window of his hayloft, looking fiercely out over his melon patch. I'd sit there by the hour and watch him, the shotgun cradled in his arm, and feel the tremors of fear and excitement chasing up and down my spine. "Look at him," my father would say. "Scared to death somebody will steal his seed melon. Wouldn't anybody steal a man's seed melon?" "He ought to be in the house taking care of that wife of his," my mother would say tartly. "She's been poorly all year." You hardly ever saw Mrs. Wills. She was a wrath of a woman, pale as a butterbean. Sometimes she would sit for an hour or two on their porch in the cool of the day. They didn't visit back and forth with anybody, though. "There's Willadine," my father would say mildly. My mother would make a funny kind of sound that meant disgust. "He cares more about that seed melon than he does his wife," she'd say. "I wish somebody would steal it. Maybe then, Helen," my father would say, chiding. "You shouldn't even think of such a thing." About the time the great watermelon was due to come ripe, there was a night of a full moon. J.D. and Freddie Gray and I had decided we'd go swimming in the creek. So I left the house when the moon rose and went to meet them. The moon floated up into the sky, making everything almost as bright as day, but at the same time softer and gentler than ever daylight could be. It was the kind of night when you feel as though you can do anything in the world, even boldly asking Willadine Wills for a date. On a night like that, you couldn't help but feel that she'd gladly accept. "Boy, what a moon," J.D. said when I met him. "Wouldn't you like to take old Willadine out on a night like this?" Freddie Gray said. We scoffed at him, but secretly in our hearts we knew how he felt. We were getting old enough to think that sort of thing might be a lot more fun than going swimming in the moonlight. As I said before, I was part of the bunch. J.D. and Freddie Gray were my good friends. But because I was still new, there were certain things and certain feelings where I was left out. This was one of them. They were afraid, because I was more of a stranger to Willadine, that she might like the idea of dating me better than she did either of them. This was all way down under the surface, because none of us had admitted to ourselves that we wanted to be Willadine's boyfriend. But far down though it was, I could feel it, and they could feel it. "I wish I had a newspaper," I said then. "I'll bet you could read it in the moonlight." We had reached the swimming hole in the creek, and we began shucking off our clothes. We were all excited by the moonlight, yelling at one another and rushing to be the first in the water. Freddie Gray made it first, J.D. and I catapulting in right behind him. The water was cold, and the shock of it struck a chill into us. But we got rid of it by a brisk water fight, and then we were all right. We climbed out finally, to rest, and sat on the bank. That big old moon sailed serenely overhead, climbing higher into the sky, and we lay on our backs to look up at it. "Old Man Wills won't have to worry about anybody stealing his melon tonight anyway," Freddie Gray said. "Wouldn't anybody dare try it, bright as day like it is." "He's not taking any chances," J.D. said. "I saw him sitting up in the hayloft when I came by, his shotgun loaded with buckshot. That melon is as safe as it would be in the First National Bank." "Shucks," I said in a scoffing voice. "He ain't got buckshot in that gun. He's just got a load of salt, like anybody else guarding a watermelon patch." Freddie Gray sat upright, looking at me. "Don't kid yourself, son," he said loftily. "He told my daddy that he had it loaded with double-aught buckshot." "Why," I said, "that would kill a man." "That's what he's got in mind," Freddie Gray said. "If anybody goes after that seed melon—" It disturbed me more than it should have. After all, I'd never had it in mind to try for the melon. Had I? "I don't believe it," I said flatly. "He wouldn't kill anybody over a watermelon, even a seed melon like that one." "Old Man Wills would," J.D. said. Freddie Gray was still watching me. "What's got you in such a swivet?" he said. "You weren't planning on going after that melon yourself." "Well, yes," I said. "As a matter of fact, I was." There was a moment of respectful silence, even from me. I hadn't known I was going to say those words. To this day I don't know why I said them. It was all mixed up with Willadine and the rumor of Mr. Wills having his gun loaded with double-aught buckshot and the boys still thinking of me as an outsider. It surged up out of me, not the idea of making my name for years to come by such a deed, but the feeling that there was a rightness in defying the world and Mr. Wills. Mixed up with it all, there came into my mouth the taste of watermelon. I could taste the sweet red juices oozing over my tongue, feel the delicate threaded redness of the heart as I squeezed the juices out of it. I stood up. "As a matter of fact," I said, "I'm going after it right now." "Wait a minute," J.D. said in alarm. "You can't do it in the moonlight like this. It's 200 yards from the creek bank to that melon. He'll see you for sure." "Yeah," Freddie Gray said. "Wait until a dark night. Wait until anybody could steal it on a dark night," I said scornfully. "I'm going to take it right out from under his nose. Tonight." I began putting on my clothes. My heart was thudding in my chest. I didn't taste watermelon anymore. I tasted fear, but it was too late to stop now. Besides, I didn't want to stop. We dressed silently, and I led the way up the creek bank. We came opposite the watermelon patch and ducked down the bank. We pushed through the willows on the other side and looked toward the barn. We could see Mr. Wills very plainly. The gun was cradled in his arms, glinting from the moonlight. "You'll never make it," J.D. said in a quiet, fateful voice. "He'll see you before you're 6 steps away from the creek." "You don't think I mean to walk, do you?" I said. I pushed myself out from them, on my belly in the grass that grew up around the watermelon hills. I was absolutely flat, closer to the earth than I thought it was possible to get. I looked back once to see their white faces watching me out of the willows. I went on, stopping once in a while to look cautiously up toward the barn. He was still there, still quiet. I met a terrapin taking a bite out of a small melon. Terrapins love watermelon, better than boys do. I touched him on the shell and whispered, "Hello, brother." But he didn't acknowledge my greeting. He just drew into his shell. I went on, wishing I was equipped like a terrapin for the job, outside as well as inside. It seemed to take forever to reach the great melon in the middle of the field. With every move I expected Mr. Wills to see me. Fortunately, the grass was high enough to cover me. At last the melon loomed up before me, deep green in the moonlight, and I gasped at the size of it. I'd never seen it so close. I lay still for a moment, panting. I didn't have the faintest idea how to get it out of the field. Even if I'd stood up, I couldn't have lifted it by myself. A melon is the slipperiest, most cumbersome object in the world, and this was the largest I'd ever seen. It was not a long melon, but a fat, round one. Besides, I didn't dare stand up. For 5 minutes I didn't move. I lay there, my nostrils breathing up the smell of the earth and the musty smell of the watermelon vines, and I wondered why I was out here in the middle of all that moonlight on such a venture. There was more to it than just bravado. I was proving something to myself, and to Mr. Wills, and Willadine. I thought of a tempting way out then. I would carve my name into the deep greenness of the melon. Mr. Wills would see it the next morning when he inspected the melon, and he would know that I could have stolen it if I'd wanted to. But no, crawling to the melon wasn't the same thing as actually taking it. I reached one hand around the melon and found the stem. I broke the tough stem off close against the smooth roundness, and I was committed. I looked toward the barn again, all quiet. I saw Mr. Wills stretch and yawn, and his teeth glistened. The moon was that bright, and I was that close. I struggled around behind the melon and shoved at it. It rolled over sluggishly, and I pushed it again. It was hard work, pushing it down the trough my body had made through the grass. Dust rose up around me, and I wanted to sneeze. My spine was crawling with the expectation of a shot. Surely he'd seen that melon was gone out of its accustomed space. It took about 100 years to push that melon out of the field. I say that advisedly because I felt that much older when I finally reached the edge. With the last of my strength, I shoved it into the willows and collapsed. I was still lying on the edge of the field. "Come on," Freddie Gray said, his voice pleading. I couldn't move. I turned my head. He was standing up to stretch and yawn to his content, and then he sat down again. By then I was rested enough to move again. I snaked into the willows, and they grabbed me. "You did it," they said. "By golly, you did it." There was no time to bask in their admiration and respect. "Let's get it on out of here," I said. "We're not safe yet." We struggled. the melon across the creek, up the bank. We started toward the swimming hole. It took all 3 of us to carry it, and it was hard to get a grip. J.D. and Freddie Gray carried the ends while I walked behind the melon, grasping the middle. We stumbled and thrashed in our hurry, and we nearly dropped it 3 or 4 times. It was the most difficult object I'd ever tried to carry in my life. At last we reached the swimming hole and sank down, panting. But not for long. The excitement was too strong in us. Freddie Gray reached out a hand and patted the great melon. "By golly," he said, "there it is, all ours." "Let's bust it and eat it before somebody comes," J.D. said. "Wait a minute," I said. "This isn't just any old melon. This is Old Man Willis's seed melon, and it deserves more respect than to be busted open with a fist. I'm going to cut it." I took out my pocket knife and looked at it dubiously. It was small, and the melon was big. We really needed a butcher knife. But when the little knife penetrated the thick green rind, the melon split of itself, perfectly down the middle. There was a ragged, silken tearing sound, and it lay open before us. The heart meat, glistening with sweet moisture, was grained with white sugar specks. I tugged at it with 2 fingers, and a great chunk of the meat came free. I put it into my mouth, closing my eyes. The melon was still warm from the day's sun. Just as in my anticipation I felt the juice trickle into my throat, sweet and seizing. I had never tasted watermelon so delicious. The 2 boys were watching me savor the first bite. I opened my eyes. "Drive in," I said graciously. "Help yourselves." We gorged ourselves until we were heavy. Even then, we had still only eaten the heart meat, leaving untouched more than we had consumed. We gazed with sated eyes at the leftover melon, still good meat peopled with a multitude of black seeds. "What are we going to do with it?" I said. "There's nothing we can do," J.D. said. "I can just see us taking a piece of this melon home for the folks." "It's eat it or leave it," Freddie Gray said. We were depressed suddenly. It was such a waste. After all the struggle and the danger, that we could not eat every bite. I stood up, not looking at the 2 boys, not looking at the melon. "Well," I said, "I guess I'd better get home." "But what about this?" J.D. said insistently, motioning toward the melon. I kicked half the melon, splitting it into 3 parts. I stamped one of the chunks under my foot. Then I set methodically to work, destroying the rest of the melon. The boys watched me silently until I picked up a chunk of the rind and threw it at them. Then they swept into the destruction also, and we were laughing again. When we stopped, only the battered rinds were left, the meat muddied on the ground, the seed scattered. We stood silent, looking at one another. "There was nothing else to do," I said, and they nodded solemnly. But the depression went with us toward home, and when we parted, we did so with sober voices and gestures. I did not feel triumph or victory, as I had expected, though I knew that tonight's action had brought me closer to my friends than I had ever been before. "Where have you been?" my father asked as I stepped up on the porch. He was sitting in his rocker. "Swimming," I said. I looked down toward Mr. Willis's barn. The moon was still high and bright, but I could not see him. My breath caught in my throat when I saw him in the field, walking toward the middle. I stood stiffly, watching him. He reached the place where the melon should have been. I saw him hesitate, looking around, then he bent, and I know he was looking at the depression in the earth where the melon had lain. He straightened, a great strangled cry tearing out of his throat. It chilled me deep down and all the way through, like the cry of a wild animal. My father jerked himself out of the chair, startled by the sound. He turned in time to see Mr. Wills lift the shotgun over his head and hurl it from him, his voice crying out again in a terrible, surging yell of pain and anger. "Lord, what's the matter?" my father said. Mr. Wills was tearing up and down the melon patch, and I was puzzled by his actions. Then I saw he was destroying every melon in the patch. He was breaking them open with his feet, silent now, concentrating on his frantic destruction. I was horrified by the awful sigh, and my stomach moved sickly. My father stood for a moment, watching him, Then he jumped off the porch and ran towards Mr. Wills. I followed him. I saw Mrs. Wills and Willadine huddled together in the kitchen doorway. My father ran into the melon patch and caught Mr. Wills by the arm. "What's come of you?" he said. "What's the matter, man?" Mr. Wills struck his grip away. "It's stolen my seed melon," he yelled. "They took it right out from under me." My father grabbed him with both arms. He was a brave man, for he was smaller than Mr. Wills, and Mr. Wills looked insane with anger, his teeth gripped over his lower lip, his eyes gleaming furiously. Mr. Wills shoved my father away, striking at him with his fist. My father went down into the dirt. Mr. Wills didn't seem to notice. He went back to his task of destruction, raging up and down the field, stamping melons large and small. My father got up and began to chase him, but he didn't have a chance. Every time he got close, Mr. Wills would sweep his great arm and knock him away again. At last, Mr. Wills stopped of his own accord. He was standing on the place where the great melon had grown. His chest was heaving with great sobs of breath. He gazed about him at the destruction he had wrought, but I don't think that he saw it. "They stole my seed melon," he said. His voice was quieter now than I had ever heard it. I had not believed such quietness was in him. "They got it away, and now it's gone." I saw that tears stood on his cheeks, and I couldn't look at him any more. I'd never seen a grown man crying in such strength. "I had 2 plans for that melon," he told my father. "Mrs. Wills had been poorly all the spring, and she dearly loves the taste of melon for eating and my melon for planting. She would eat the melon, and the next spring I would plant the seeds for the greatest melon crop in the world. Every day she would ask me if the great seed melon was ready yet." I looked toward the house. I saw the 2 women, the mother and the daughter, standing there. I couldn't bear it any more. I fled out of the field toward the sanctuary of my house. I ran past my mother standing on the porch and went into my room. I didn't sleep that night. I heard my father come in, heard the low-voiced conversation with my mother, heard them go to bed. I lay wide-eyed and watched the moon through the window as it slid slowly down the sky and at last brought a welcome darkness into the world. I don't know all the things I thought that night. Mostly it was about the terrible thing I had committed so lightly, out of pride and out of being 16 years old and out of wanting to challenge the older man, the man with the beautiful daughter. That was the worst of all, that I had done it so lightly, with so little thought of its meaning. In that country and in that time, watermelon stealing was not a crime. It was tolerated, laughed about. The men told great tales of their own watermelon stealing days, how they'd been set on by dogs and peppered with salt-loaded shotgun shells. Watermelon raiding was a game, a ritual of defiance and rebellion by young males. I could remember my own father saying, "No melon tastes as sweet as the stolen one," and my mother laughing and agreeing. But stealing this great seed melon from a man like Mr. Wills lay outside the safe magic of the tacit understanding between man and boy, and I knew that it was up to me, at whatever risk, to repair as well as I could the damage I had done. When it was daylight, I rose from my bed and went out into the fresh world. It would be hot later on, but now the air was dew-cool and fragrant. I had found a paper sack in the kitchen, and I carried it in my hand as I walked toward the swimming hole. I stopped there, looking down at the wanton waste we had made of the part of the melon we had not been able to eat. It looked as though Mr. Wills had been stamping here too. I knelt down on the ground, opened the paper sack, and began picking up the black seeds. They were scattered thickly, still stringy with watermelon pulp, and soon my hand was greasy with them. I kept on doggedly searching out every seed I could find, until at the end I had to crawl over the ground, seeking for the last ones. They nearly filled the paper sack. I went back to the house. By the time I reached it, the sun and my father had risen. He was standing on the porch. "What happened to you last night?" he said. "Did you get so frightened you had to run home?" "It was frightening to watch him, I'll admit that." "Father," I said, "I've got to go talk to Mr. Wills, right now. I wish you would come with me." He stopped, watching me. "What's the matter?" he said. "Did you steal that seed melon of his?" "Will you come with me?" I said. His face was dark and thoughtful. "Why do you want me?" "Because I'm afraid he'll shoot me," I said. My voice didn't tremble much, but I couldn't keep it all out. "Then why are you going?" he said. "Because I've got to," I said. My father watched me for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "I guess you do." He came down the steps and stood beside me. "I'll go with you," he said. We walked the short distance between our house and his. Though it was so near I had never been in his yard before, I felt my legs trembling as I went up the brick walk and stood at the bottom of the steps, the paper sack in my hand. I knocked on the porch floor and Willadine came to the screen door. I did not look at her. "I want to talk to your father." She stared at me for a moment. Then she disappeared. In a moment Mr. Wills appeared in the doorway. His face was marked by the night, his cheeks sunken, his mouth bitten in. He stared at me absent-mindedly, as though I were only a speck in his thinking. "What do you want, boy?" he said. I felt my teeth grit against the words I had to say. I held out the paper bag towards him. "Mr. Wills," I said, "here's the seeds from your seed melon. That's all I could bring back." I could feel my father standing quietly behind me. Willadine was standing in the doorway watching. I couldn't take my eyes away from Mr. Wills's face. "Did you steal it?" he said. "Yes, sir," I said. He advanced to the edge of the porch. The shotgun was standing near the door, and I expected him to reach for it. Instead, he came toward me, a great, powerful man, and leaned down to me. "Why did you steal it?" he said. "I don't know," I said. "Didn't you know it was my seed melon?" "Yes, sir. I knew it." He straightened up again, and his eyes were beginning to gleam. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. "And my sick wife hungered for the taste of that melon," he said. "Not for herself, like I thought, but to invite the whole neighborhood in for a slice of it. She knew I wouldn't ever think of anything like that myself. She hungered for that." I hung my head. "I'm sorry," I said. He stopped still then, watching me. "So you brought me the seeds," he said softly. "That's not much, boy." I lifted my head. It was all I could think to do. I said, "The melon is gone, but the seeds are next year. That's why I brought them to you." "But you're ruined this year," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "I ruined this year." I couldn't look at him any more. I looked at Willadine standing behind him. Her eyes were a puzzle, watching me, and I couldn't tell what she was thinking or feeling. "I'm about as ashamed of myself last night as you were of yourself," Mr. Wills said. He frowned at me with his heavy brows. "You ruined the half of it, and I ruined the other. We're both to blame, boy. Both to blame." It seemed there ought to be something more for me to say. I searched in my mind and discovered only the thought that I had found this morning in the gray light of dawning. "The seeds are next year," I said. I looked at him humbly. "I'll help you plant them, Mr. Wills. I'll work very hard." Mr. Wills looked at my father for the first time. There was a small, hard smile on his face, and his eyes didn't look as fierce as they had before. "A man with a big farm like mine needs a son," he said. "But Willadine here was all the good Lord saw fit to give me. Sam, I do wish I had me a boy like that." He came close to me then, put his hand on my shoulder. "We can't do anything about this year," he said, "but we'll grow next year, won't we? We'll grow it together." "Yes, sir," I said. I looked past him at Willadine, and her eyes were smiling too. I felt my heart give a great thump in my chest. "And you don't have to offer the biggest melon in the world to get folks to come visiting," I blurted. "Why, I'll sit on the porch with Willadine any time." Mr. Wills and my father burst out laughing. Willadine was blushing red in the face, but somehow she didn't look mad. Flustered, I began to beat a retreat toward the gate. Then I stopped, looking back at Mr. Wills. I couldn't leave yet. "Can I ask you one thing, Mr. Wills?" I said. He stopped laughing, and there was no fierceness in his voice.
Anything you want, boy, he said.
Well, I just wanted to know, I said, was there double-aught buckshot in that gun? He reached around and picked up the gun. He unbreeched it and took out a shell. He broke the shell in his strong fingers and poured the white salt out into his palm. You see? He said. Yes, sir, I said, taking a deep breath. I see. I went on then, and the next year started that very day.